Virginia. Good morning, everybody. How am I? Is this too live or too? Can you hear me? Richard, can you hear me? You're the test case now, I guess, huh? How many of you during this past week had one of those exciting experiences that make your liver quiver? I mean, something that just gets you on a spiritual high. Makes you feel real good, and particularly spiritually. I had two this week. It happened a lot of times, but one of them was Monday at the eclipse, and we had several of us watched it here in the churchyard, and I thought, isn't it amazing that science can be so precise? That they told us exactly the minute, even to the second, when the eclipse would start, how long it would last, how long the shadow of the moon would, the sun would be completely behind the moon completely in front of the sun, and the eclipse would be total, and exactly when it would end. And I thought, isn't it marvelous that science can do that? But then you know what I thought? Isn't it marvelous that there's a power that created that with such precision? I think we see the glory of God in the heavens time and time again. And while we marvel, I marvel at what science does, but I marvel more at the Creator, whose power and majesty and might and artistry are revealed more and more in the things we see. The other time was, I went to the football game Friday night. Did any of you see the high school play Friday night? I told Betty I figured out that, what's his name? Is it Grant Stiles? That little guy that really runs, boy, he can run. And I said to Betty, do you know why he can run so fast? Why that little guy can run as fast as he does? And she said, no, why? And I said, it's because those great big brutes are chasing him. But it was a good game. But what really thrilled me was at the beginning the cheerleaders came out. You know when they put up these great big paper banners and the team runs through them. Well, they brought it out and they laid it on the ground, and from the stands we couldn't read it real well until they lifted it up. And do you know what was written in great big letters across it? I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I get choked up then. I'm in my wife said, that got you all choked up. I said, yeah, it did. I didn't know, wouldn't it? Now. But I was so thankful. I was so thankful that our high school did that. And it had a little excerpt about each of the players, and many of them used that as their theme. Well, at least two I noticed, as it gave a little statement about each of the players. At least two of them, maybe more, used that at their theme. And I was so thankful that I live in a community where that still happens. And the second thing about it was the crowd cheered. When they displayed that, a cheer went up, and I thought, wow, there aren't many communities like that. And I just was, it made my liver quiver. And I pray that our community might stay like that. That somebody's going to object, don't you think? Yeah, somebody's going to come along and say that's breaking down the separation of church and state. But I'm sure thankful that as yet that's still honored in our community, and keep praying for that we'll still have that freedom here. Last Sunday I preached a message on the church, dealt with the price of the church, and pointed out that the price was nothing less than the blood of Christ, the Son of God. Pointed out that the church is not a building or basically an organization, it's more an organism, but it's people. Its price is the blood of Christ. It is people, the church is people, and it has a divine purpose. So we talked last week about the price, the people, and the purpose of the church. Next week, we're going to talk about the functions of leadership. And what I'm preaching this morning, when I first started thinking of this series, I wasn't going to preach on this text because you've heard so many sermons on what we call the qualification of elders and deacons. But as I got thinking of the total aspect of it all, I thought, well, we need to do that. And here's the reason we need to do it. Because the fact that what we are determines what we do. Now, next week, we're going to talk about the function of elders and deacons and what they do, what their specific roles might be. But you know, you can do a lot of things and yet not be what you ought to be. A lot of people do things hypocritically. They do things that show. But I want us to speak more today. And in the third chapter of 1 Timothy, we often call it the qualifications. I'm going to talk about the character or the integrity of leadership this morning. Because, you know, what we are really determines what we do. We can have a good reputation, which is one thing, but character is another. There are people who have pretty good reputations in the community, but inside there's something else. Reputation is what people see and what people think of us and what appears outside. Character is what we are down deep inside. And if there's going to be good leadership, there must be good character. There must be integrity in those who are leaders. I read a few days ago that our word character comes from a term from a foreign language that meant chisel. It comes from the word chisel. Now, you know, when you make statues or, for instance, the huge appearances of the presidents on Mount Rushmore, that's a lot of chiseling, isn't it? But there's a difference between chiseling and just putting a veneer on something. Because chiseling actually cuts into the material of the thing. It makes it something that is more permanent than, for instance, a coat of paint. I don't know if Clayton will remember this or not, but our dad was a mechanic, and he often did body work. He would refinish cars, did automobile body refinishing. And when that took place, you had to sand the car down to a real smooth surface, and sometimes Eldred, our older brother, and me quite reluctantly, and I guess sometimes Clayton, would help him in the sanding down of the cars to get them ready. And you had to sand them down to get all the old paint off and make it just a silky, smooth, shiny surface. He had two basic qualities of paint jobs that he did. One was enamel. And when they sprayed enamel on a car, it left it with a glossy finish. But there was another one, which was lacquer. And when he painted a car with lacquer, it didn't have a glossy finish when it was finished. It had kind of a misty, almost pebbled finish. And in order to get it to look like it ought to, you had to rub it and rub it and rub it and rub it with compound. And then you put polish and wax on it. And then it had a high gloss and a long-lasting, harder surface than the enamel. Well, one day a man came in, and he asked Dad about painting his car. So Dad told him what it would involve, and gave him a price on it. He gave him a price on lacquer and enamel, and told him the advantages of lacquer, how it was longer lasting, and after all the rubbing was done, was even a higher gloss. So he said, well, that's what I want. And he also knew we had to take the old paint off. So before he brought it in, he and his sons, perhaps thinking that it would save some money, started to scrape the paint off with the chisel. And they brought it in, and Dad said, do you still want a lacquer job on this? And they said, yeah. And he looked at it and he said, well, you know, I will never be able to cover up those chisel marks, because it not only had scraped the paint, it had gouged down into the metal. And he said, we can put all kinds of paint and coats of paint on there, and we can wax it and shine it, but those chisel marks are still going to show through. And he said, well, fortunately, he had only done this on the trunk lid. He hadn't done the whole car. But he brought it in, and we sanded it down, and Dad lacquered it, and then we rubbed it and rubbed it and rubbed it and rubbed it with the compound and put the wax and the polish on it. And he came in to get it, but guess what? On the trunk lid, it was still rippled. Those chisel marks were still there. And Dad said, I hope he doesn't tell anybody who painted his car. Because you see, when something is chiseled, it's embedded, it's deep. And that's the word, I understand, that is the root of our word character. It's not just something over the surface. It's something chiseled deep in us. So today, even though we've done it a lot of times, we're going to look at the 3rd chapter of 1 Timothy again. What we often call the characteristic or the qualifications of elders. I'm going to deal with the characteristics. What really ought to characterize, what ought to be the deep down chiseled in nature of a person who's going to serve in church leadership. Well, let's read together, and I think we have it up here. Faithful is the saying, if a man seeks the office of a bishop, he desires a good work. Now, I want to stop there just a minute to point out that some people say the first qualification is to seek the office. Well, notice that it says if, and then later it says must be. So when he describes the character of the elder, he says this is what he must be, but he says if he does this. Of course, that's to his advantage, but it isn't necessarily what we would say is one of the qualifications. It's an if clause. And if he has that, that's good, and it's going to make it easier to serve. But is it ever possible to serve well if you have started it reluctantly and maybe thought, I wish I didn't have to do this? I think probably the most fruitful ministry I've ever experienced in our 50 or so years of ministry was a church where I had been asked to come there and consider becoming their preacher. I interviewed with the leadership, and they were going to make a decision a couple of weeks later, and I went home and prayed and prayed and prayed that they wouldn't call me. We were leaving a very comfortable ministry to go there, a ministry where we were treated probably better than any other place we'd ever served. And I prayed, please, Lord, don't call me there. Guess what? They called us. And I had to consider that the call of God. It wasn't something I'd been... Now, I had said something that opened the interview, that's true, but it wasn't something I really thought I wanted to do. But I felt the Lord called me there. And if you were to compare the before and the after, it was the most fruitful ministry we've ever had. And so I believe the Lord called me there in spite of my reluctance. So this is saying that if you desire the work of the eldership, that's good, and you desire a good thing. But you know, you might enter a ministry, an area of service that you really didn't Jesus pray about the cross, if it be possible, what? Remove this cup from me. So the if is an if clause. The must be is another clause. Rick Russo said one time, and he's preaching in Longmont, Colorado now, having a fabulous ministry with a huge church there. He had been the associate minister at Fort Myer when we first knew him. Later he became one year the president of the North American Christian Convention. But Rick said one day, when I was at Fort Myer, I was happy. I liked it there. But Cincinnati Christian, or Bible Seminary, now Cincinnati Christian University, called me to come up there and work with them, and I didn't want to go there. And so I prayed, Lord, don't call me to Cincinnati. But he called me to Cincinnati. And I had been there a while, and I was really enjoying that ministry as a part of the administration of the Bible College when I got a call from Longmont, Colorado. And I said, Lord, please don't call me to Longmont, Colorado. But the Lord called me to Longmont, Colorado. And he says, now I pray, Lord, please don't call me to Hawaii. But my point is this, that sometimes the Lord may call us to something that we wouldn't have anticipated, may not have been our first choice. But if we desire it, and if we stretch forth for it, if any man seeks, the translation says, I like the NIV translation here, it says, if any man sets his heart on the work of a bishop, he desires a good work. Sets his heart on it. And the word that is sets his heart on is the word from stasis in the Greek. And the word stasis has as its basic meaning stretching forth, stretching out, reaching, trying to lay hold on something that requires a stretch. I don't know if Clayton will remember this, but some years ago when we were living in Miami, there was a story in the newspaper about a young man who wanted to be a police officer. He was a quarter of an inch shorter than they required. So he rigged a device in his home where he could hang himself up. I don't know if he put it under his arms or on his feet and hung himself upside down, but he spent hours hanging himself off the ground so he would stretch. And he did it. He gained that extra quarter of an inch just by stretching his body. And he got called. He got his job as a police officer in Miami. And there are times like that. And I think it's interesting that that's the concept of the word when it says he seeks or he sets his heart on. He wants to do it. He sees something that challenges him, and he realizes he's going to have to stretch. But he stretches in order that he can do it. And notice it says he desires a good what? Work. Not political clout. Not a prestige position. He desires a good work. Then it talks about the characteristics he's supposed to have. So let's look at them again. The bishop must therefore be without reproach, the husband of one wife. Later it's going to say, having his children in subjection with all gravity. And that, of course, means he's to be a good family man, a faithful husband, one who has been able to lead and guide and be an example to his children. And repeatedly throughout the Scripture, we learn this, that the real basic institute of society is what? The family. The family. And that's important for good leadership. He's to be a one-woman man. He's to be a good father. And the home becomes a training ground. Someone said it's a microcosm of the church. And the person who wants to be a leader needs to be a faithful husband and a good father. Then it says he's to be this temperate. Now we think of temperance, and what do we think of? Well, usually we interpret temperance as meaning the small indulgence or use of something not good. That's not what it means. It means the right use of good things. It doesn't mean he can dabble in things that are right if he just does a little of it, if he's just temperate about it. But temperance, the concept is the proper use, the moderate use of the right things. And then it tells us he's to be sober-minded and orderly. He's to think clearly. He's to be well organized. He's not to be a scatterbrain. He's to think things out. And he's to be organized, to be orderly, in the way he handles himself. And then he says this, given to hospitality. What a tremendous power that can be in the church. And of course, I think when we look at these, we wouldn't say, well, I'm not an elder, so I don't have to do any of that. Because they are the examples of what everybody in the church ought to be. They're the leaders and they're the examples. So if a elder is setting an example of hospitality, what should we be? Hospitable. And boy, that can have a tremendous impact. I mentioned last Lord's Day the time we stopped in Moore, Oklahoma, and the preacher was gone. They just asked me to preach that morning. But one of the things that impressed me is one of the ladies in the church, an elder's wife, I believe, and it was Betty and myself and John, our son, and his wife and their son, 5 of us. And she right away said, won't you come over after worship and have dinner with us? And she said, I'll just add a little more water to the soup, but we'll have plenty. But we had a great fellowship. Hospitality. And I've not forgotten that. We were strangers, but she invited us to come to their house for dinner. Probably one of the most impressive things that's happened in that line is some years ago, Betty's mother and father, both who are deceased now, but they visited us in Miami, Florida, and they were going back to their home in Streator, Illinois. And on their way, they had an accident in Marietta, Georgia. Well, we knew a man who had been instrumental. He wasn't a preacher. He'd been an elder in the church and instrumental in starting a church in Miami. He was now living in Marietta, and Larry and Grace Howland. And when we got the telephone call that Mom and Dad had been in an accident and Mom was in the hospital, Betty called the Howlands right away. And she told Larry, she said, my dad's has been in an accident with Mom, and Mom's in the hospital. Well, what did they do? Larry was right over to the hospital. He called on her in the hospital, and Dad was there, and he found out that Dad was going to have to stay there a day or two till she got out of the hospital. And he said, you're staying with us, John. You come and you stay at our house as long as you have to be here. And Dad did. And he never forgot it. That impressed him all his life. And in that day, when most of the preaching was done as apostles and those whom they taught traveled about, they were dependent upon hospitality. Remember when Jesus spoke of, when he sent out the 12 and said, if you enter into a city and they receive you, stay there. And he, as a matter of fact, said, don't take any extra clothes with you. Don't take an extra staff. Depend on the people to take care of you. And that was so needful then. It's needful now. The church ought to be the most hospitable, welcoming institution in the country. An elder is to be given to hospitality. Then it says he's to be apt to teach. An aptitude for teaching. Well, really, as we're going to see a little bit later, that's one of his major purposes for being an elder, to be able to teach the word. It says over in Titus, he's to be able to exhort in sound doctrine and convict the gainsayer. So he's to prepare himself with the word. He's to know the word. He's to be apt to teach. Now, how were such people appointed? And the fact is, it uses the word appoint. It uses that in Acts 14:23 when Paul is on his first missionary journey. He goes into Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe, and then he comes back from Derbe to Lystra to Iconium and Antioch. And that missionary journey took probably a little less than 2 years. But as he was coming back on that missionary journey, it says he appointed elders for them in every city. It was for them. He appointed elders for them. Now, how was that done? We saw a little bit of this and was dealt with in our Sunday school class last Lord's Day morning, that when there was a time when the church in Jerusalem needed somebody to take care of the benevolent ministry, the ministry to widows, the apostles appointed them when? After the congregation had chosen them. The apostle says, you choose out 7 men from among you who are wise and full of the Holy Spirit, and will appoint them over this business. Now they, the congregation, made the choice. And that word there is haragetai. Haragetai. The congregation made the choice, but they made the haragetai, the appointment. They set them aside, and I think it was mentioned in our Sunday school lesson last week that that's what happens in ordination. We set people aside to a certain ministry. Now, that's the same word that's used when Paul tells Titus, I left you in Crete for this reason, to set in order the things that are wanting and appoint. It's that same word that's used in Acts 6 after the congregation had made the choice. Elders in every city. And when Paul came back through Asia Minor or through Galatia there, he appointed on his return trip, not on his way out, on his return trip, he appointed for them elders in each city. Now, evidently for the church to mature, it was needful that they have elders. And because he wanted them to mature, he appointed elders for them. And I'm convinced the same word is used there, haragetai, that he appointed those whom they had a voice in choosing. So they were chosen, and he then appointed them. Well, we look at that passage in Matthew 14, and we say, well, doesn't elder mean mature? Yes, it has the concept of age in it. It means maturity. But how could these people, when the church was less than 2 years old there, be people of maturity? Well, remember this. When Paul went into a new city, what did he do first? Where did he go? Synagogue. Who did he preach to first? The Jews. And some of them, not all of them, not even most of them, in fact, most of the Jews rejected him. But in each case, there would be some of the Jews who did hear the gospel. Well, what had they heard? If they had really known the scriptures and paid attention, as probably they had known of a promised Messiah. And they also knew what eldership in the Jewish system was, because the Jewish system had an eldership. And I'm convinced that these first elders were men who had a spiritual background in Judaism, who knew what elders were, who knew their responsibility to oversee and to teach the church, and were ready by virtue of a strong spiritual background, now having accepted the Messiah, were presbyteros, mature enough to be able to be elders. You know, I was teaching a lesson one time on the virtuous woman in Proverbs 33, and it comes down to, I think it's verse 23 of that chapter, and it speaks of the virtuous woman who goes all over the place, you recall, to get food for her family, and she bakes and she sews and she weaves and she does all this stuff, and it pictures what a hardworking woman she is, and I believe it's 23rd verse of that chapter says, her husband is known when he sits in the gates with the elders of the land. And one of the ladies in the church says, why did that woman work so hard for that old geezer that just sat down at the gate talking with the good old boys? Well, it says he was sitting with the elders of the land. And the Jewish people had elders. And the elders were responsible for the affairs of the city. They were sort of like city councilmen in each city. And that was an important thing in the Jewish system. So I'm convinced that there, among even those churches which were fairly young, there were people with a strong spiritual background who knew what elders had been, how they were teachers and they were overseers, and they were guardians of the flock. And as Paul comes back, he appoints some to be elders like that. They were to help take care of the flock. Now I'm going to anticipate next Sunday's sermon a little bit here. Because while we're talking of the characteristics, I want us to point out that the elders were to be men of maturity, yes. They were also to be shepherds. They were thought of as shepherds. And in the 17th chapter, and this is what we're really going to deal with more next Lord's Day, but in the 17th chapter of Acts, in the beginning of that chapter, in the 20th chapter of Acts, in verse 17 and in verse 28, Paul uses the term presbyteros, elder, episkopoi, which means an overseer, bishop, and poimen, which means a shepherd. He uses them interchangeably. And in Titus, when Paul writes to him, he speaks of appointing elders in every city, and then says the bishop, the overseer, must be. And again, he uses those two terms of the same office. So as we read the Bible, the word elder, presbyteros, the word episkopoi, bishop or overseer, the word poimen or pastor are all used of the same office. Some years ago, when I was preaching here, we learned this. We're going to do it today. We're going to do it next Lord's Day. An elder is a bishop, is a pastor, is an elder, is a bishop, is a pastor, an elder, is a bishop, is a pastor. Now, I know that's not the way it's set up in today's ecclesiastical arrangements. But in the New Testament, that's the case. The term elder, the term bishop, the term pastor. The term elder would imply age. The term bishop pictures their oversight, and I'm preaching next Sunday's sermon now. And the term poimen means shepherd or pastor. And they're all used of the same office. And we're going to illustrate that more clearly next Lord's Day. Let's learn that. Say it with me. An elder is a bishop, is a pastor, is an elder, is a bishop, is a pastor. And an elder is a bishop, is a pastor. They're all the same office in the New Testament. We'll illustrate that a little more clearly next Lord's Day. Well, we're not going to be able to get to the rest of these. You've heard a lot of sermons on them. Read it over. Read the first chapter of Titus where it describes what the characteristics of a leader in the church ought to be. The question, we'll ask the praise team to come forward now. The question is this. When you look at the church, first of all, we need to see that in our eldership. But are there those who desire to take places of responsibility and leadership? Well, if they do, if they desire to be an elder, they're to stretch. They're to stretch forward. They're to realize that this is a challenge. I didn't even get into the part about deacons, but one of the things that it says about a deacon as a deacon is to be grave. What does that mean? He's to be serious. He's to be serious-minded about it. He doesn't say, well, I'll give it a whirl. It's not just a thing that he accepts or flips off as of insignificance. And positions of leadership in the church are significant. They're important The welfare of the church is dependent on them. And that's why the Scripture says they're to be people of character, people of integrity. Do you ever think, well, someday one of my sons, and of course preachers always like to see their sons be preachers, I guess, but I think it was John said with us one day, when I grow, and there was an elder in the church, and this was in a church in Orlando. It wasn't the church we were serving. But he says, when I grow up, I want to be an elder like Emery Drake. And he saw in that man something that made him want to be. I would have loved to have him say, Dad, I want to be a preacher like you. But he didn't. He said, I want to be an elder like Emery Drake. And that's a commendable aspiration. The church needs godly leadership. And my question to the congregation today, if you see the need for leadership, are you willing to stretch yourself? And that's my question to the whole church. If you see a need for ministry, are you willing to stretch yourself to put forth the effort to be the kind of person with character and integrity that God wants in His church? Only leaders of integrity, only leaders of character can ever build a church. I've seen the opposite. I can take just a couple more minutes to point out that several things here are negative. What he's not to be. He's not to be a brawler. And incidentally, that word is a word of broad interpretation. As a matter of fact, I think the NIV says not characterized by drunkenness. And the word brawl there pictures a person who acts like a drunk, who gets in brawls. He's not to be a striker. In Titus, he says he's not to be self-willed or soon angry. Have you ever seen leaders like that? Yes. I've seen self-willed leaders ruin churches. Once in our experience, a striker or a brawler I was calling in our first ministry. I'd been there a couple of years, and it was a good church. It was a small country church, but it was I thought a beautiful congregation, lovely people. It was in the country. I was out calling one day. I stopped at a farmhouse and told the people who I was and said, I preach over there at the Lone Oak Church. We'd love to have you come. And the guy said, that's the place where they had the fight in the churchyard, isn't it? No. Can't be. I could not believe it. He said, yeah, their leaders got in a fist fight out in the churchyard. So I went back to a man who's one of our favorite people of all our ministry, passed away several years ago, had been an elder there. And I said, Lee, I was out calling today, and these guys told me there had been a fight in the churchyard here. And he says, yeah, that happened several years ago. But you see, character and attitude makes a difference. That church had a stigma on it for years because of brawlers and strikers and self-willed and soon angry leadership. Godly leadership makes godly churches. So read them over, study those. And are you willing? Are you willing to stretch yourself? Are you willing to make a decision? This morning, if you've never accepted Christ, and it's not easy, I don't believe these characteristics are unattainable. Difficult, yes. High standard, yes. But not unattainable. Now, not everybody is going to be perfect in each of them, but he's going to have some element of that character in him, that characteristic in him. So the challenge while we speak of leadership is to all of us to grasp the character of what God would have the people who are the church to be. And you can only be all you ought to be as Christ Jesus is your Lord. That's why I was so thrilled at the sign that said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And if you need to live a life that has purpose, and if you need to do something that's meaningful, that's significant in this world, you need the strength of Christ. If you've never accepted Him, if you've never yielded to Him, if you've never said, I believe He is the Son of the living God, if you've never surrendered your life by allowing your very body to be buried, as you in your heart and soul are willing to die to sin and let your body be buried in baptism, that Christ might come in and be the strength of your life, you're always invited to that. If you need to make any other decision, if you need to say this morning, I'm going to stretch some more, I'm going to try harder to be what God wants me to be, this is the time of invitation, and you're invited to step forward. Will you stand as we sing?